All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a good cake break. My name is Lincoln Davies. I'm a professor at the law school and the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce our next panel, which focuses on energy and climate issues related to air quality, and features three of the brightest minds, really, in energy law and policy today. First, we'll be hearing from Sonia Carley, who's a professor at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. Then we'll be hearing from Penny Crossley, who is a professor at Sydney Law School in Australia. And finally, from Dave Spence, who is a professor at the Business School and the Law School at the University of Texas, Austin.
Good afternoon. It's a distinct pleasure to be here and to kick off this session. We all agreed that the last session primed us very well for some of the topics that we'll talk about. I just hope that you don't come down from your sugar crashes while we're in this session. So I've chosen to focus my remarks today on renewable energy markets, and in particular, policy instruments that are used around the world to incentivize and mandate the growth of these renewable energy markets. Now I'm going to start with a 1,000-foot view of a very important issue, and this issue is access or a lack of access to modern sources of electricity. This is a picture taken from NASA, and it's taken of the night sky, looking down at the globe, and what you can see here is that access to modern sources of electricity is highly uneven. You can make out lights, and in fact you can probably make out grids or electricity grids across space. You can see that some places are very much well lit. They have access to electricity anytime they want. When you walk to the wall and you flip your light switch, you're pretty much always guaranteed to have some kind of light turn on. But there are plenty of other places around the world that don't have access to electricity, that are quite literally in the dark. Approximately 1.4 billion people around the world lack access to modern sources of electricity, and this is approximately 20% of the world's population. Energy and electricity is a basic enabling good, access to which provides opportunities, economic development and growth opportunities, health and educational opportunities, social opportunities, and in particular, energy access is associated very negatively with environmental problems. Now here I've given you a different map, and this is a map of the world in CO2 emissions, or relative CO2 emissions. I'm not particularly interested in the fine-grained detail of this map, but just the broader takeaways or the generalizations. You can see here that the shaded circles essentially represent the relative share of CO2 emissions by country. So there are some countries that contribute a disproportionate amount of CO2 emissions and thus contribute disproportionately to climate change. Countries such as China in particular, as well as the US, India, Russia, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and others. The CO2 emissions are primarily attributable to the burning of fossil fuels for transportation, industrial sectors, or electricity. I could show you a different kind of map that looks just like this for a variety of other forms of air pollution. Now I'm going to focus in, instead of taking such an aerial view, and go straight to a house. This is a house in Rwanda where a woman sits next to a kerosene lantern. This kerosene lantern is her sole source of energy in this house. And kerosene lanterns are quite common in the developing world. They provide opportunities for this woman's children, for example, to study during non-daylight hours. They might also provide the opportunity for this woman to run some kind of informal business out of her home. However, the effects, the environmental effects and the economic effects, among others, of kerosene lanterns are quite severe. Kerosene is attributable to approximately 1 million deaths per year and contributes approximately 100 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. Now, another form of energy that is commonly used in the developing world in particular is woody biomass. My intent here is not to get involved in the debate that happened earlier today about the effects of combustion of biomass. But in short, some of the positive benefits of using biomass is that it can be used for wood stoves. It can be an open stove or a closed stove. It can be used to cook food, to cook one's food, or to keep a house warm. However, it too has a variety of fairly severe environmental effects, in particular, the emissions, the fairly significant emissions of particulate matter, as well as contributions to black carbon, which is essentially incomplete combustion of a source of energy. And modern, very recent studies have demonstrated or have argued that black carbon is a very significant contributor to climate change. In particular, it's thought to contribute approximately 25 to 50, which is a fairly large range, percent of CO2 emissions emitted globally. As these visuals suggest, there's an immense need to extend energy access across the globe. And in particular, I'd like to highlight that it is important to consider low carbon energy sources or low environmental pollutant energy sources for this expansion. Now, clearly, as our last panel discussed, it's important to consider a balanced portfolio, or it doesn't have to be balanced as much as a portfolio of different energy options. No single energy option is going to provide everything for any given place. And in the energy world, we always say there's no silver bullet. You'll hear this adage at every single conference you ever go to. But it's particularly important to consider, among other resources, low-carbon energy sources. The international development community has particularly started to recognize the need for sustainable energy. And the UN, in particular, in 2013, highlighted the year as Sustainable Energy for All. Now, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to define some of these renewable energy resources, because I think that the types of energy resources are important for considering where they are around the world and which policy instruments we use to incentivize them. So I'll begin with the upper left-hand corner, and this here is a wind turbine, and down here is also a wind turbine. And what wind energy is, essentially, is taking advantage of the kinetic energy of wind to turn turbine blades. You can have wind turbines onshore or offshore. In the middle, sandwiched between these two different types of wind energy, is geothermal energy. And what geothermal energy is essentially tapping down into the Earth's core to extract some of the heat in fluids that's embodied there, and using those fluids to either create electricity or to just simply use that heat in other forms of applications. Up top here in the center, we have a form of either wave or tidal energy, and this is also taking advantage of movement, similar to the kinetic energy of wind. And this is the movement of water. So it's tapping into the movement of water and converting it to electricity. And similarly, in the middle, we have here a picture of a hydroelectric dam. A hydroelectric dam essentially takes advantage of potential energy. It's the difference between an upper reservoir of water and a lower reservoir of water, where the water has to drop. Now, I think it's really important to give a caveat here. Many people don't consider hydroelectricity to be a source of renewable energy because there are fairly severe ecosystem effects attributable to hydroelectricity. In particular, hydroelectricity has effects on ecosystems, on fish populations, on populations, human populations that live around hydroelectric dams. It affects water sediment and water quality. And at times, in some places, we actually see a buildup of sediment that contributes an increased amount of methane emissions. So it's important to have those caveats in mind about hydroelectricity. Down here, we have solar panels, and solar panels can be either solar photovoltaics, and photovoltaics are essentially taking advantage of the photons from the sun to create a direct current. Fun fact, this is the only renewable energy source that can directly create electricity, not through some other application. Or you can have solar thermal panels, which are essentially taking advantage of the movement of photons and taking advantage of the vibration to make heat, and then you can use that heat for other applications. You can also have solar thermal panels that are so large, there are so many of them, for example, that you can concentrate the power, and these are called centralized solar plants, where you've essentially concentrated the power and you have, or that heat, and you have so much heat that you can then create electricity. And on the right-hand side here, I have highlighted three different forms of biomass. So in the upper corner, we have landfill gas. So this is from trash. We could use some other kind of byproduct or off-product, if you will, such as animal waste or human waste to create energy. We can also grow dedicated crops or use byproducts from crops, as pictured in these two pictures. In order to burn, you can combust or you can directly convert to a gas or a liquid form. So this is the suite, if you will, of renewable energy technologies, and all of these are technologically proven at present day. The only ones here that are not used in wide-scale applications are the tidal and wave power that are up here, and these are primarily just pilot applications around the world. Now, if you look at renewable energy generation around the world, and you look at the trends, this is from 1990 to 2010, with the green line representing the growth in renewable energy generation or production over time. We can see that renewable energy has grown fairly significantly over this time period. And I've broken this down by OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries, and non-OECD countries. And we can see here that the different groups they both contribute with an inflection point around 2004 when non-OECD countries started to surpass OECD countries. Now this slide demonstrates the concurrent decrease in the price of renewable energy sources over this time period. So this is 2010 to 2014, and it's broken down by each type of renewable energy. This is average prices, or what are called levelized cost of electricity, which is essentially annualized costs in cents divided by the kilowatt hours that are produced within a year. The circle, the size of the circle, represents the capacity size or the power size of these units. So what you can see here with the lines that are drawn, for example, here looking at solar photovoltaic, that's the difference between the 2010 average and the 2014 average across the world. So what we can see is that the prices of renewable energy have dropped fairly significantly over this time. Some of them, a huge amount, in particular, solar photovoltaics, which have dropped in price by 3/4, and wind energy, which has dropped in price by approximately 1/4. Now, one other thing that I'd like to point out here is this yellow/orange band around the 0.1 levelized cost of electricity mark. This is essentially the band with standard deviation of the price of a conventional forms of electricity, so take coal or natural gas, for example. So this is the traditional price range. So in juxtaposing the prices of the renewable energy sources, we can see that some of these prices have actually come down to be comparable or within the range of conventional sources of electricity or energy. Now, I wouldn't be giving you a complete picture if I didn't also tell you that these prices vary across the world. And so this slide it gives you symbols, essentially, to represent different countries. So you can see that there's some price fluctuation depending on which, not country, but which continent you're in. By and large, Asia tends to have the lowest prices, and North America tends to be down there for the majority of renewable energy sources. So what I'm starting to get at here is that there's a cycle. There's a cycle where we have expanded renewable energy production over time, and concurrently we're having a drop in prices. And clearly there's some kind of relationship here between the two. Now, there's nothing surprising about this. With any new emerging technology, it tends to be fairly expensive at the proof of concept stage in the early market penetration stages. But over time, as it starts to gain market maturity and you have technological advancement and learning by doing and economies of scale, we tend to see the price of these technologies decrease. Now, case in point, this graph is for solar photovoltaic panels, and it's directly putting together a line of production rates, so the increase of production rates over time, with the decrease in the cost of silicon panels. So we can see a very, very direct relationship here. However, there's another aspect of this cycle that I haven't yet articulated. And this aspect of this cycle is the use of government support to encourage the technological advancement of these, in this case, renewable energy technologies. So again, this is fairly standard for any technology. When you have a new emerging idea, you essentially, it's oftentimes the case that you need some kind of support to get through those early proof of concept stages, all the way through into the stages where consumers start to be interested in these products or services, and through the stage where they can compete with other sources. In this case, perhaps compete with conventional sources of energy. Now, this is where I focus the bulk of my research personally. I'm particularly interested in the policy mechanisms or the policy instruments that one can use to advance renewable energy markets. And in my research, I ask questions such as, which policies could we use to encourage renewable energy growth around the world? Or are some of these policies more effective than others? So in a recent avenue of inquiry, I've looked at this exact question on the global scale. And I'm particularly interested in how a couple of very prominent policy instruments that we use across the world are encouraging or not encouraging the advancement of renewable energy markets. So I'm going to take a second just to define the two policies that I'm interested in here. The first is what's called a feed-in tariff, and I assume that many of you are probably quite familiar with this policy. What it is essentially a production incentive. It's an incentive that is guaranteed to the owner of a renewable energy system. So if you, for example, decided that you wanted to put a solar panel on your roof, if you lived in a place that had a feed-in tariff, then you could put that panel on your roof and you'd be guaranteed access that you could hook up to the electricity grid. And then you could take energy from the grid when you wanted, but you could also dispatch your energy back to the grid when you wanted. And in return, you would earn a fairly substantial rate of return on that energy that you put back. Now, in some places, feed-in tariffs also create some kind of preferential treatment where you are the first consumer, you're the go-to consumer, essentially, for your energy before the utility goes to others for that electricity. Feed-in tariffs are very common in the European context, and they have been studied fairly extensively to date in that context to look at what are the effects and whether or not feed-in tariffs are, in fact, effective at driving renewable energy, with the overall consensus that they are playing a very strong role in these markets. Now, another prominent policy that I assume that you guys are even more familiar with is what's called a renewable portfolio standard. A renewable portfolio standard is essentially a percentage mandate that a state or a country has to achieve so much renewable energy out of their total portfolio or their total electricity mix by a certain terminal year. So this graph is just an illustration of what one place might look like. So let's say a country in the starting period had 80% coal and 17% natural gas and a very small amount, 3% of all renewable resources. They then set a goal of by 2025, they will have 50% renewable resources, approximately 40% of which might come from wind, 10% might come from solar. They can specify those amounts or they can leave it open to the market, and the rest remains fossil fuels. Now, Utah does have a renewable portfolio standard. However, for all intents and purposes, it's, I would say, a voluntary standard because of the escape clause that's written into the legislation that utilities must comply with this policy so long as it is cost-effective to do so. But a renewable portfolio standard has been used in a lot of different states, not just Utah, and it's become increasingly prevalent in other places around the world. Now, this graph shows those same years that I showed you earlier, 1990 to 2010, which is the study period for the piece that I'm presenting to you right now. And this is just to demonstrate that the adoption of these policies has increased fairly significantly over this time. So if you remember back to the renewable energy production graphs, recall that those trends were going up. At the same time, we're seeing these trends of adoption go up with these policies. Now, just to highlight where these exist around the globe, you can see here that these are feed-in tariffs. There are a lot of them in European countries, but there are also plenty elsewhere around the world as well. And these are the renewable portfolio standards. You can see that there's a little bit of overlap, so there are some countries that have both, but by and large, countries choose one or the other, or none at all. Now, also consider where we've actually seen renewable energy growth. This is just one snapshot in time. This is just 2013 markets. But if you look at the yellow and light green and dark green, so these are the countries that have developed or at least have more capacity additions within 2013, you can see that there's actually some kind of overlap between the maps that I just showed you in terms of those countries that have the policies versus those countries that don't. So in the research I'm presenting today, I ask what drives renewable energy markets? What drives renewable energy development and deployment? I'm particularly interested in the effects of these policy instruments, but I'm also interested in what are some of the other mechanisms, what are some of the other supporting conditions, if you will, economic conditions, political conditions, and so forth, that essentially allow these markets to thrive. So what I do is I divide all countries, I essentially create tertiles, or a 3-country separation, where I divide countries by gross national income per capita, or GNI per capita, which is a common metric used to measure essentially economic income, if you will, so the income of countries. Now, I divide these into the lowest, the medium, and the high, and just to give you an idea of some of the countries that are in these different tertiles. Down here in the lowest tertile, examples are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Sierra Leone, Vietnam, Angola, and so forth. In the middle tertile, I have Belize, China, Ecuador, South America, Thailand, and others. And in this highest tertile, we have the United States, Japan, Israel, Denmark, a variety of other European countries, as well as Australia. Now, the assumption here is I'm presuming that there are some differences across economic status in the way that these markets develop. So that's the reason that I believe it's important to actually divide these countries into these different groups to get a sense of some of the different underlying conditions that are important across these different country contexts. Now I'm just going to jump straight to the results instead of putting up statistical models for you or statistical results. And I'm going to do so in arrow depiction. So I'm going to start with, this is the highest group. So these are countries such as the US and Australia and Japan and European countries. And the first thing to note is that I find a very strong presence of RPS policies, in that RPS policies are in fact major drivers of renewable energy generation in these countries. What I'm not finding, however, is that feed-in tariffs are associated with renewable energy market developments in these countries. Now you may scratch your head and say, but didn't you tell me just a little bit ago that in the European context that feed-in tariffs were found to be quite effective? And this result doesn't essentially argue against that. It just argues that when we expand our sample to other countries that have also adopted feed-in tariffs that fit within this high income status country grouping, that the feed-in tariff is no longer effective on average. Now, other factors that are particularly important in the highest income status countries are healthy or robust economic markets. So the idea here is that if you have an economic market that can essentially give true signals as to what the risk is of investing in a different resource, and it provides a guaranteed rate of return, if you will, on your investment, that you might have a more robust renewable energy market. Now I'm going to switch to the medium tertile countries. And the first finding is that feed-in tariffs in middle-income countries are, in fact, significantly driving renewable energy growth. I should note that not enough countries in the medium tertile have actually adopted renewable portfolio standards to include them in the statistical model. So by not seeing renewable portfolio standards here, it's only a function of not enough of these countries have actually adopted this policy to date. But those that have adopted a feed-in tariff have experienced significant gains in their market developments as a result. Instead of economic factors here that are particularly important for the supporting environment, I find political factors are very important, and in particular, the leaning of the executive, so more liberal-leaning executives tend to be associated with greater incidences of renewable energy deployment. And also, in the reverse direction, I find that when you have a strong fossil fuel industry, and when that presence is so great that they contribute a great share, essentially, of a country's gross domestic product, that this negatively affects renewable energy development. Finally, I find that there are a variety of supporting policy mechanisms that are particularly important for these market developments. One is just general subsidies, so dollars that are given to the consumer or the producer to adopt these technologies or to purchase these technologies. But also what's referred to as the clean development mechanism. And a clean development mechanism is one aspect of the Kyoto Protocol, where essentially Annex 1 countries, or those countries that are signatories that have vowed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, can offset their emissions by spending money, by essentially investing in projects in Annex 2 countries, or those countries that have not signed on to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so this offset essentially allows them to invest in, instead of reducing their pollution in their country, invest in renewable energy projects in a recipient country. So this is actually very strongly driving renewable energy in this medium tertile group. Now to turn to the lowest tertile group. Within this group, there is very little adoption of these policies of interest. So there are very few countries that have actually adopted a feed-in tariff or a renewable portfolio standard. And one could argue that the reasons for this are that the political and economic conditions are potentially, in some cases, so severe that it doesn't make sense to adopt a policy before essentially improving the market conditions or the political situation first. So in particular, the political factors, again, are driving markets in the lowest tertile as they are in the medium. But one thing that I've highlighted here in red is a new factor that is political freedom. And political freedom essentially is a measure of civil and political liberties. That is your ability to vote, your ability to have an electorate that is representative of the population, an ability to have freedom of speech, and a variety of other factors. So this is very strongly related to whether or not a country will actually invest in renewable energy. Next, I also find that subsidies and clean development mechanism, again in this lowest tertile group, is strongly driving these markets. And similar to the highest tertile, I find that economic conditions, positive economic conditions, in particular, the ability to invest foreign direct investment and strong capital markets are associated with renewable energy deployment. Now, before I'd end, I'd like to just think about what kinds of renewable energy are being developed in these different places. So I've now given you a picture of what's actually contributing to the development and how influential, if you will, these policy mechanisms are. But I think it's just important to say, well, if this is the case, if these markets are developing, how are they developing? Which types of renewable resources are being developed? And are there any implications of this? So here I again have my three tertiles, my lowest, my medium, and my highest. And I'm going to start right here with the lowest tertile. Now what I've done is I've broken this down into total renewable energy development, and then I've broken that into hydroelectricity and all other sources. So go back to my earlier statements about the potential problems associated with hydroelectricity, and bear that in mind. So you can see here with the lowest tertile group that very little renewable energy was developed over this time period. They have the least out of all of the three tertiles. And the majority of that was hydroelectricity that was developed. This is between 1990 and 2010. So what this suggests is that one of the first go-to sources of energy for these countries is hydroelectricity when they're looking to expand their energy access. This is particularly looking at renewable energy. I think we should also note that one of the other resources that's a first go-to is coal. If we look at the medium tertile group, we can see that they expanded their renewable energy the most over this time period, fairly significantly. The bulk of which, however, was from hydroelectricity. So we have a similar story here. We have a lot of growth of these markets, but the majority of it is in hydroelectricity. If we then turn to the highest tertile, we can see that there's a decent amount of renewable energy growth, and the majority of it came from all other sources of renewable energy, so non-hydroelectricity. In fact, if we were to zoom in on individual countries, I could tell you individual stories about a lot of countries that are actually retiring their hydroelectricity plants. They're walking away from them, either because they have such severe droughts on an annual basis that they can no longer support them, or because the ecosystem effects were so severe that they've decided to abandon them. So in conclusion, I'd like to just present this picture and remind us that there's not only uneven distribution, thinking back to the beginning of this presentation, uneven distribution of access to electricity, as well as contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, but there are also differences or uneven distribution of the types of resources that are being adopted and the use of policy instruments. So up in the upper left here, we have, this is actually Okosombu Dam, which is in Ghana. It's been around for quite a while. This isn't a new dam, but this is just to indicate that as a result, particularly of robust economic markets and a political supporting environment, as well as subsidies and clean development mechanism support, that we've seen these countries develop, in particular, a lot of hydroelectricity. If we were to zoom in on the very small scale, so this is distributed generation or pico generation, we also see in a lot of these countries the use of these very small units, essentially these household-sized units. And this is, for example, this is in Guinea. These are small pico solar photovoltaic panels that sit on a roof. So we see this range, essentially, of hydroelectricity and then these tiny applications in these lowest tertile as well as some of our medium tertile countries. Now, if we think about our highest tertile countries, I point you to these two pictures down at the bottom. In the US, our experience with the renewable portfolio standards has primarily led us to develop wind technologies. Over 90% of all new renewable energy that we've developed as a result of RPSs in the United States has been from wind in particular. And in the European context, it's a little bit more varied. Remind yourselves that this is the context where primarily they're adopting feed-in tariffs, and these are tariffs that are essentially being given to the consumer, the everyday consumer like ourselves, who have household applications. And as a result, what we see is that there's a high incidence of solar panels that are being put on individual homes or industrial factories or commercial buildings. Now, there's plenty of wind there as well, but particularly we're seeing the incidence of solar development. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm a bit shorter. So I'm Penny Crosley. I'm from Sydney Law School, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. With full disclosure, it was actually quite hard to find a photo of bad pollution in Sydney. This is actually in the middle of a bushfire. And when I wake up of a morning and can smell smoke, I know that we've got bad fires around. But bushfires actually for us are quite a serious concern. So what I'm addressing today are national renewable energy laws designed to address environmental issues. And these are just some of the headlines that we've seen in recent years. So one of the things that really struck me when I began researching this topic was we've got issues like 24 million years of life are being lost in China due to air pollution. 24 people die for every terawatt of coal combusted. And the one that really shocked me, other than the huge global death toll, was that in Sydney, we have more people dying from air pollution-related causes every year than in our entire state from the motor vehicle accidents, which for me was really quite surprising. But I want to involve you. So my question to you is, do you think that national renewable energy laws, and I know that you're at a bit of a disadvantage here, but work with me, are designed to prioritise environmental concerns? So what I'm going to ask you to do is raise your hand if you think that countries put in place a national renewable energy law because of environmental concerns. Hands up. Do you have that law? Nationally? No. But I'll come on to that, and I'll come on to how all that works out. So that was about a third of the room thought that there are national renewable energy laws prioritising environmental concerns. So the first thing that we start to think about when we think about national renewable energy laws is why we have them. And the reason why we have them from an economic perspective is because that there are market failures within the energy sector that mean that renewable energy isn't allocated efficiently. So when we think about markets, economists will normally tell us that markets are generally going to be the most efficient and effective way of allocating goods and services. But where we've got a market failure, that produces a suboptimal result. And in terms of renewable energy, there are three key market failures that impact on the sector. The first one is the presence of unpriced negative externalities associated with fossil fuels. So this can be things like air pollution, climate change, health impacts, and failing also to price in the positive externalities associated with renewable energy, such as addressing climate change and ensuring energy security. The second market failure that we see are positive spillovers and learning effects. So what that means is that where a private firm invests in research and development, because the way in which that research occurs, some of that information is made public or is capable, more likely, of being reverse engineered, often by the Chinese, that they don't actually receive the full financial benefit of their research. And the third one is information asymmetry. So this is where we see hidden characteristics within the market that affect our ability to understand future conditions. It creates uncertainty and pricing issues. But for our purposes, looking at air pollution, it is that first market failure that really focuses our attention on regulating the renewable energy sector. So I would like to talk briefly about some of my research. I've conducted a comparative study where I've analysed the renewable energy laws of every country that had one as of 1 January last year. That was 95 countries. It meant doing searches in Arabic, looking for the Yemeni law, doing searches in Catalan, looking for the Andorran law, and getting them all translated. And I also looked at the EU Renewable Energy Directive as well as the International Renewable Energy Agency statute. And what I was doing was I was trying to test a range of features, including how do they define renewable energy? And that was something that I thought we all knew the answer to, until you realise that the Russians include coal bed methane within their definition. So this study is actually quite important. The Swedes also included peat. within their definition of renewable electricity. And one of the things that I was testing was legislative objectives. So does the reason why a country says that they're legislating actually marry up with those economic justifications? And so what I did is I went through and I identified them all using what we call the legislative objectives section. Now, what a legislative objective section is for the non-lawyers in the room is it's the bit of the law, normally at the start, that tells us the economic, political or social goals that a country is trying to achieve in their legislation. And the reason why these are really valuable is they're somewhat suggestive of legislative intent, but they provide a very clear signal to the sector and to industry as to why we're legislating and what the likely future direction of law and policy in the sector is going to be. Where they're also very specific and measurable, we can also then use them to benchmark against to see whether these laws are a success or a failure. So for us, they're incredibly valuable. Full disclosure, they're not often used in the United States. So in my study, out of the 95 countries that had a national renewable energy law, 79 of them actually had a legislative objective section, and another 6 countries and the International Renewable Energy Agency, as well as the EU, had a preamble that fulfilled that role. So it was actually quite a valuable test. And so what I did is I took those legislative objective sections and I coded them. And I coded them into 8 key themes, which I've put up on the PowerPoint slide, and then into 28 more specific categories. And as I went through and was reading them, using the principles of statutory interpretation, which we lawyers love to do, I actually went through and identified in each country what their highest priority legislative objective was, and I gave that a 1. The second highest got a 2, and we went down the line. And what I found was that countries on average had 5 different legislative objectives within their legislative objectives section. But for our purposes today, I'm just going to focus on those most closely associated with air pollution, given the theme. So the question that I'm posing in this next section is, with regard to air pollution, does the economic justification for regulating within the sector match the reality? So the good news, and there was a bit of good news, the good news was that out of all of the 8 themes identified, environmental objectives were the most commonly cited theme to accelerate or promote the deployment of renewable energy. Unfortunately, it was often a lowly ranked priority. So the average weighted rank for the objectives in this section was a 4.31. And so out of the context of countries having an average of 5 objectives, you can see that it is actually quite low. And the other thing that I found was the more closely a category aligned to our market failure, particularly the one about the unpriced positive and negative externalities, the less likely it actually was to be cited as a legislative objective. So categories that were purely environmental, such as reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address climate change, ranked comparatively lowly. But as soon as the categories that incorporated an economic or social aspect, such as sustainable development, were included, they actually ranked considerably higher. So what we saw was that some of the environmental categories ranked as lowly on average as a 7. So outside the average number of objectives for each country. And it seemed to suggest that some countries were just whacking on the environmental objectives at the end as a bit of an afterthought to keep often the Green parties happy. So I'm just going to talk about 3 categories and then I'll talk about Australia and what we've been doing there. So the first category that I wanted to talk about in terms of air pollution is reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address climate change. Now, we know that energy use, and by energy use I mean not just electricity but also heat and transportation, accounts for 75% of all greenhouse gas emissions. What was interesting to me, though, was that as of today, there are 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol. Yet only 22 countries mention within their renewable energy law any objective relating to reducing greenhouse gas emissions or climate change. The other thing that was quite interesting was, with the exception of Australia, the majority of countries on this list actually were very early parties to the Kyoto Protocol. But even then, you can see there that actually most countries have this as a lowly ranked priority. So you can start to see Tajikistan, it ranks 4, but in Peru, they have 13 other legislative priorities ahead of this one. Bulgaria, it's 12. South Korea, it's 8 priorities ahead of this one. So it really is quite striking. So countries that do prioritise this, so countries like Australia, Austria, Bangladesh and the Czech Republic, are often focused on rapidly deploying renewable generation regardless of the size or the location of the project. They may also prefer to have renewable energy technologies that produce lower greenhouse gas emissions over their life cycle. So what this means, and I think this probably bears out with Sonia's research, is that woody biomass and new large-scale hydropower might be avoided because of their effect in creating methane over the life cycle, whereas you might encourage landfill or sewage gas because you actively use the methane that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. Environmental protection was another interesting category. It was actually the most cited out of all of the legislative objectives. It was mentioned by 49 of the 95 countries, so just over half, which was great news. Unfortunately, again though, it tended to be quite lowly ranked, and it was actually ranked on average at less than a 5, and that's predominantly because you can see here countries, again like Indonesia, are ranking it at a 14. So what we tended to see, though, is that in this section, there are a whole range of reasons why countries were putting environmental protection into as a goal for their renewable energy laws. So it included dealing with problems such as air pollution, unsustainable water use and pollution, thermal pollution, waste, as well as other problems such as acid rain, waste disposal and loss of biodiversity. What was interesting, though, was that the countries within this grouping actually on average have a higher level of energy self-sufficiency than the countries in total. So the average for all countries was 79.8% of their energy was produced domestically, but within this group it was actually 83.2% of their energy was produced domestically. But the thing that was really interesting about this grouping was their own profile of energy use. So the average for all countries with a renewable energy law was per capita, they were using 10,240 kilowatt hours of electricity per annum. In this group, though, they actually used a third more than that, and their average was over 15,600 kilowatt hours per year per capita. So that actually suggests that countries tend to worry about environmental protection when they're actually heavy electricity users themselves. Despite this, there have been studies within the United States of renewable portfolio standards, including a fantastic study by Lyon and Yin, where they actually found that areas, unfortunately, such as Utah, where you have a clear environmental issue, actually had no significant effect on the timing of the adoption of their renewable energy laws, which was an interesting outcome. Where we prioritise, though, environmental protection, one of the things that becomes quite interesting is what happens if we decide to prioritise air pollution within our environmental protection. So if I was to prioritise air pollution, I would be encouraging people towards technologies such as photovoltaic solar, wind and hydropower over the woody biomass. And that's where that would get shelved. I should add that woody biomass in Australia is a particular issue because we've had debates about using old growth forests to provide our woody biomass as a renewable energy source. So I think it's even more controversial if that's possible in Australia than it is here. So these are the countries, though, this is the third category I'll talk about before turning to Australia, and these are the categories who cited improved public health. There aren't many of them. This clearly is not seen by countries as being a legislative goal for them. And I think that's because of a lack of awareness. You'll note in that grouping of the 5 countries that it has both Belarus and the Ukraine, both countries which suffered after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which is why I'm guessing that they're actually on that list. Countries that had improved public health, the average rank for all of those countries is actually over a 7. And again, they tend to be focused on reducing reliance both on fossil fuels but also reducing traditional biomass use. And again, these countries, when you read their laws, they are in fact worried about particulate emissions, the effect on heart attacks, strokes, lung cancer and asthma. But I'd just briefly like to focus you on Australia. So this is the Australian piece of legislation. And I think Australia makes for a really interesting case study because in our renewable energy law, we're actually one of the few countries in the world where we only prioritise the environmental goals. So we've actually had a renewable energy target in Australia since 2001. It's currently set at 20% of a baseline level of electricity by 2020. That baseline level was 41,000 gigawatt hours, or 41,000 gigawatts, sorry, I should say. And we've now split it into a large-scale target and a small-scale target. In Australia, between 2012 and July 2014, we also had a carbon tax. And this carbon tax was a fixed price on carbon of $23 per tonne for the 2012-2013 financial year, rising to $24.15 for the 2013 to 2014 financial year. And what we found is the combination of having a renewable energy target and a price on carbon made investing in renewable energy incredibly attractive. And it really altered the price signals to the market about the types of energy sources and technologies that people should be investing in. So following the introduction of both of these features, what we saw is that when companies were deciding whether to invest in renewable energy or not, they began to price in the presence of a carbon tax. And these are often 30-year financial models because that's how long these projects often go for. And the carbon tax was actually very successful. In its first 2 years of operation, it actually reduced carbon emissions from the electricity sector in Australia by 7.6%. Very, very efficient. And that was even with a lot of kind of carve-outs. We were quite soft on large emitters initially, and the plan was that by 2015, we'd actually be moving into an emission trading scheme with a floating price. But the introduction of the carbon price was very controversial with 2 sectors of the Australian society. The first sector was the mining sector, who tend to be a very large emitter, and the other sector was the aluminium smelting industries, who again are a very large emitter. And so this prompted our Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party in Australia is actually the Conservative Party, and in its current form it's probably closest to the Tea Party. In fact, I'm embarrassed to admit, but our current Prime Minister once stated that human-induced climate change was, and you can insert in your own expletive at that point. And so he ran on a platform that he would scrap the carbon tax and reduce cost of living pressures in the 2013 election. Now, they were elected largely due to other factors. We'd had a huge number of leaders through the Labor Party. But once elected, they believed that they had a mandate to repeal the carbon tax. And it was one of the first things they did, and they've actually declared it to be their greatest achievement in their first term in government. And instead, what they plan to introduce, but they haven't yet introduced, is to inject carbon into soil, which is proven to be a significantly less effective measure. So once the carbon price was repealed, not only did this change the financial model for the existing projects, but it also had a really significant impact on future projects because it meant that our policy and regulatory environment in Australia had become really uncertain. And so they needed to factor in a risk premium. In conjunction, they also put in place much more stringent planning permissions, particularly for wind farms. We've had a lot of concern in Australia about wind turbine syndrome, even though it has been repeatedly shown not to exist. And so our government has actually chosen to adopt the precautionary principle on a medical condition which doesn't exist. And I can't tell you how frustrating I find wind turbine syndrome. I've written many government submissions about how ridiculous it is. Our National Health and Medical Research Council has said it doesn't exist. Your various medical bodies have said it doesn't exist. The Canadian ones have said the same. The British have said the same. I've got nothing to add. I'll change my mind when the evidence is clear. The only thing that they have shown is that people who are naturally prone to anxiety are naturally prone to feel anxious when there's a wind turbine erected. But the other thing that we've found is that you're actually 10 times more likely to suffer from wind turbine syndrome if you haven't been compensated for having a wind turbine on your land, but your neighbours have. I get death threats from our anti-wind farm activists in Australia. I'm not all that popular with them. It frustrates me no end that this is the thing that they choose to adopt the precautionary principle on, as opposed to air pollution, climate change, or any other one of the myriad of options they could choose. So what we've seen is we've actually seen since July last year, we've seen an 88% reduction in large-scale renewable energy projects. We're back to 2002 levels of investment. We're basically a case study on how not to do it at the moment. They're currently reviewing our renewable energy target with a view of reducing it from 41,000 gigawatts down to 26,000 gigawatts. It's been in the Parliament. It was in Parliament again today. It hasn't been resolved, thankfully. Long may that continue. But it is quite frustrating. So my point here is, this is fantastic so long as you have a government that A, believes in climate change, or B, is at all concerned about environmental impacts. This was going great guns for us, right up until the point that we got a government that didn't believe in either, and then it actually became quite a risky phenomenon. So what do we need to do? Well, the first thing I'd argue we need to do is we need to look at this issue of unpriced externalities, such as those associated with air pollution. And if we do say that that is a priority, it needs to be prioritised in these laws. We need to really find that balance between economic development and energy security, which I might add is the most cited reason for having renewable energy laws, with the protection of the environment and health. And it's actually quite easy to do. This is how the Filipinos have done it. I think it's quite a nice clause. Reads quite nicely. Encourage the development and utilisation of renewable energy resources as tools to effectively prevent or reduce harmful emissions and thereby balance the goals of economic growth and development with the protection of health and the environment. So, just to sum up, renewable energy laws really should be a massive aid in addressing air pollution, given the impacts that we know that energy use has on generating much of the air pollution that we see today. But don't assume that just because you've got a renewable energy law that that's actually the role it's designed to play. Often it's not, and it's something that we need to watch quite closely as we move into the future. And please feel free to come and visit Sydney. Got a lovely campus, nice air, so that's me.
Good afternoon. Before I get started, because we had a number of questions earlier today about the people seeking information about estimates of the costs of the external costs of energy, I quickly jotted down on a slide a couple of recent studies that try to put a dollar figure on these pollution costs. These are tend to be in the American context, but this is basically what I could remember. I'll leave this slide up while I introduce my talk if you want to write these down so you can sort of Google it and find the details later. I thought that might be helpful. So first, let me join other speakers in thanking Lincoln Davies, Aaron Reardon, the Stegner Center, and the Quinney College of Law for organizing this wonderful conference and for inviting me to participate in it. It's been a very interesting discussion today, and I appreciate being here. It's my first time in Salt Lake, and I'm enjoying the beautiful scenery and the interesting discussion. I'm here today to talk about electricity markets. And before you all run for the exits, let me explain why I'm talking about electricity markets. So we've been talking a lot today about all the things we need to do or should do or could do to green the energy mix, the electricity mix in particular, because these are important aspects, important elements of dealing with the clean air problems, the air pollution problems that we face. And we tend to conceive of these policies and these policy instruments from the top down, but in fact, we are not going to really do much of anything about determining which electricity sources get built and which ones get used. The market will do that, and so it's important that we understand electricity markets and understand how they work and understand how they sometimes, especially more recently, can operate in ways that make it difficult to green those markets. And so that's why I think I'm on this panel. I think that's why I was invited, and that's what I'm going to talk about. This is an outline of my talk. I'm not going to go over all these bullets, but it's just sort of the order of the ideas I'm going to talk about. I'd like to talk about how electricity markets have changed in most of the United States, and my talk will be about the United States, will not be about the world. But I want to talk about important changes over the last couple of decades that have placed an even higher premium on providing the least cost source of power, which can sometimes make it difficult to steer toward greener sources of power. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll get into a more granular discussion of how these markets work, and then we'll talk about what the implications of all that is for some of the policy ideas we've been talking about today. All right, but first I want to start with this slide. I took information from the Energy Information Administration, historical data on the percentage of electricity generation each year from various sources of electricity. There are a few sources missing from this graph. Prior to 1980, there would have been a line that at least would have been visible above zero for oil-fired generation, but that's pretty much dwindled to next to nothing. Hydro's left off this line because although it's a significant number, it's pretty much flat. All the good spots have been taken for hydro in the United States, and so it's not growing or changing. But these other sources, and nuclear is not changing that much either, except to sort of steadily or gradually go down, I think, over the next few years. But the other lines are the ones that I think are most interesting. We've heard today about the harmful effects of emissions from coal-fired power plants. One of the frustrating things for me in coming to participating in energy policy debates is the way we talk about fossil fuels good, fossil fuels bad, fossil fuels yes, fossil fuels no. I think after today we can all agree that all fossil fuels are not created equal. Coal-fired power shifts more harm to society than any other source. It kills more people in the United States each year than nuclear power, civilian nuclear power, has ever killed in its history worldwide. And so the way the markets work and the way coal and natural gas substitute for one another in these markets is important. It's important to recognize. As natural gas has gotten less expensive relative to the price of coal, natural gas, nationally at least, has displaced coal in the electricity generation mix. And at least as far as combustion is concerned and the conventional pollutants, the criteria pollutants we've been hearing about all day, that's a tremendously large environmental benefit. That has produced a tremendous environmental benefit for us. And so that's, I think, that's something we have to keep in mind, and we have to remember that that the market will determine which electricity sources get used. We can try and move that market. We can try and use environmental law to make certain sources more expensive and give a leg up to cleaner sources and make them less expensive. But in the end, what we're doing is we're pushing at the edges of a market where it's like turning around a big ship on the ocean. We're trying to move the market, and we're not planning from the top down. And so that's just something I thought would be helpful to keep in mind as we go forward. So let me talk a little bit about how electricity markets have changed. 20 years ago, in every state in the United States, most of us were served by investor-owned utilities who had a service area, and they were the monopoly provider within that service area, and they generated most of the power that they sold to us. They were the generator, they were the wholesaler to themselves, and they were the retailer to us, right? And they did this under a regulatory compact that's guaranteed that as long as they acted prudently and made reasonable investments, they would earn a fair return on those investments. And we didn't have any choice about who we bought our power from. In many states we still don't, but in some states we do. We didn't have any choice on who we bought our power from, and the price was set by a regulator. The retail price was set by the State Public Utility Commission. Since the mid-90s, that has changed in two important ways. First of all, wholesale markets have been made competitive, and market pricing has been introduced into wholesale markets in most of the country. Now, the map at the top right is a picture of sort of wholesale markets in the United States. The green parts of that map are places where we don't have so-called organized wholesale markets managed by regional transmission organizations or independent system operators. These are the euphemisms in energy law we use for these organizations that manage wholesale markets. And you'll see the Mountain West is one of those areas, and the Southeast is the other. But the rest of the country has these organized wholesale markets, and in these places, much less electricity is generated by the retailer. There's many more third-party transactions by which retail sellers of electricity purchase power from other third parties for resale to us, the customers. And so what's grown up after the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC as we call it, because we have to pronounce every acronym. We have to turn everything into an acronym, and then we have to pronounce that acronym in energy and environmental law. FERC, by introducing competition into this wholesale electricity market, has essentially created a boom in an explosion of sort of new providers of electricity, merchant sellers, and just geographically broader, much more robust power markets. And in particular, in those non-green areas of North America in the upper right-hand side, we see very, very active markets straining the transmission grid because we're now getting power from further away than we ever did before, and causing management problems for the grid operators in these parts of the grid. We also, the second sort of phenomenon that's happened over those 2 decades is that in some states, we have gone to retail competition as well. That is, retail purchasers can choose the company from which they buy power. That's true in my home state of Texas. That's true in most of the Northeast, I think all of the Northeast, parts of the Middle Atlantic, and parts of Midwest. And so I can go to the PUC website in Texas, punch in my zip code, and up comes about 200 different choices in terms of contracts, terms and prices of which are different, to buy power from about 50 or so different suppliers. Several of those are green power contracts. I could buy green power if I wanted to. Same thing in New York, same thing in Pennsylvania. So we have retail competition and choice in those states, and in the other states, we still have retail regulation, regulated power under the old system. But in many of those places, the company that's the monopoly seller to you, even though the retail prices are being set by the regulator, they're buying a lot more of the power that they sell you on the wholesale market, these competitive active wholesale markets, than they used to. They used to generate most of it themselves. So those are the big changes over the last couple of decades in electricity markets. The other big set of changes that operate sort of side by side with those are attempts to green those markets, to provide incentives for green energy in those markets. So you have these two forces happening at the same time. Movement toward competition, movement toward market pricing, and then we also have a sort of an explosion of policies that are designed to try and promote the development of green generation technologies. So renewable portfolio standards, about which we've been hearing, is one of those types of policies, and the lower right-hand map here shows a picture of the states that have renewable portfolio standards. But then along with all of that are all of the federal rules that we were talking about this morning. So all of that sort of alphabet soup up there, at least the lower part of it is, NAAQS we've talked about, the cross-state air pollution rule we talked about a little bit earlier today, the MATS rule we've talked about, the greenhouse gas new source performance standard. We didn't talk about that too much, but that's a new rule, proposed rule from the EPA that would impose strict greenhouse gas emissions limits on new fossil fuel power plants. The proposed rule has set the standard at a level that will allow natural gas facilities that are new to comply without doing much of anything because they're already pretty efficient, but new coal-fired power plants would have to essentially capture carbon and sequester it if they were to be able to comply with the standard that applies to them. And then, of course, the Clean Power Plan, which is the proposed rule that applies to existing coal-fired power plants. And then, of course, the tax credits, production tax credit and investment tax credit, that have sort of on and off over the last 30 years existed to try and provide incentives for renewable power as well. All of these policies are pushing toward greener electric generation, a greener mix of generation sources. So they're sort of working side by side, sometimes in tension a little bit. Now the grid, the way the grid operates, the way it's always operated in the United States and in most of the world, is that the grid has to remain in balance at all times. We do not have the ability to store economically commercial quantities of electricity on the grid. And so at all times, the operators of the grid have to balance the amount of power coming onto the grid against the amount that's being taken off by you and I when we consume electricity. And so that's a challenge, and that involves dispatching plants when demand goes up and taking plants offline or off the grid when demand goes down. And that decision is typically made on a least cost basis. The Federal Power Act demands that prices in the wholesale market be just and reasonable, and that's interpreted to mean that we dispatch power to the grid on a least cost basis, meaning the cheapest plant is dispatched first, second cheapest next, and so forth. And cheapest means lowest marginal costs. That's what it means. It means the lowest marginal cost, which means the fuel costs and the costs of sort of operating costs that go up and down when the plant goes up and down in terms of output. So that's how dispatch works. And the only qualifier on that least cost, lowest marginal cost goes first rule is that you don't follow that rule when it would jeopardize the reliability of the grid. So we call this security-constrained least cost dispatch rule, or security-constrained economic dispatch, which goes by the acronym, again, I said everything has to be an acronym, SCED or SCED. And so over the history of our grid, that's the principle we have used. It is sacrosanct among electrical engineers. It is the rule we dispatch on a least marginal cost basis. For wind and solar, that's good, right? Their marginal costs are essentially zero. So they get dispatched when they are generating power, unless doing so would jeopardize the reliability of the grid. And then the next lowest marginal cost fuel or generation technology comes next, and so on. When I say security constrained, different resources can ramp up and down at different efficiencies. So combined cycle natural gas turbines are particularly efficient at ramping up and down quickly. They're very good at supporting the variability of wind and solar. They're very efficient at that. A big coal-fired power plant or a big nuclear plant is not so good at that. They don't ramp up and down as efficiently to back up wind. So as we get higher penetrations of wind, you remember from the first picture that non-hydro renewables were they were that bottom line. They were growing quickly, but they were a tiny portion of the generation mix. As we get higher penetration of renewables, we we start to see challenges in maintaining reliability and changes, at least compared to historical norms, in the way the grid is operated. But we are starting to see in certain parts of the country at certain times of year or at certain times of day situations where we're getting pretty high penetration of renewables. These are two examples here. The MISO region is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. That was the part of that map of RTOs and ISOs that was in the upper Midwest, although it comes down now into the southern central part of the country. They had a period late last year where 25% of load for a week on average was provided by wind power. That's huge by historical standards. And Texas, we haven't quite got to that yet, but we've had periods in Texas where very large percentages of load are provided by wind. In fact, we have a problem that sometimes we have too much wind. The wind in Texas tends to blow at night. Demand is low at night. The wind gets a production tax credit of 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and because they can make money by dispatching power to the grid, even when the price is zero, they will sometimes pay up to something less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour to put that power on the grid. So sometimes marginal prices in Texas at night are negative, at least in certain parts of the state. So anyway, we're starting to see higher levels of penetration of renewables. First wind, I mean, wind has had a head start on all this, but as we heard earlier, the costs of PV solar, photovoltaic solar, are coming down really, really fast. And in parts of the country that are particularly sunny, and West Texas is included in that, but Arizona, the Mojave Desert in California, central station PV solar is competitive with whatever the marginal generation technology is in those areas. The city of Austin just signed a very inexpensive contract with a PV solar developer that is very competitive with gas and other sources. This high penetration of wind can pose problems for existing sources. Because wind and solar get dispatched whenever they're providing power, they're not really dispatched. They just go on the grid. They can't sort of choose. They can't ramp up and down. They just generate when the wind blows or when the sun's out. But because they're dispatched that way, sometimes some sources, generation sources that are not really made to follow their load to ramp up and down in response to wind and solar have to do that. In particular, coal, if it has to ramp up and down, these big old coal plants were built to turn them on and just run all the time, very high capacity factors. That's when they're efficient. If they have to move their output up and down in response to changes in wind or changes in solar, they're not very efficient at that. It puts more wear and tear on the facility, but more importantly for our purposes, it results in the emission of more pollutants per unit of output than if they just ran the plant straight without ramping up and down. So this is a picture of, I don't remember what part, this is a simulation rather from the Western Wind Integration Study done by the NREL, the Renewable Energy Laboratory. And it's a simulation of what would happen at I think it's more than 30% penetration of wind over a period of time. And you can see that the black part there, coal is having to ramp up and down quite severely in this scenario. Wind is the blue part of this map. In this particular part, this was modeled at a particular part of the Western grid. In this particular part of the Western grid, which could be someplace like here or Colorado, lots of coal, not much gas. I don't know if there's much gas in Colorado. Is there much gas here in Utah, gas-fired generation? I don't know the answer to that. But in this picture, there's very little gas. You have nuclear at the bottom, and even nuclear has to ramp a little bit, and that's inefficient for a nuclear power plant. So just a way of saying that if we envision a future in which we have lots and lots of wind and solar backed up by something to make sure the lights stay on when these intermittent sources are not generating, it poses challenges for grid operators that are different from the ones they've faced in the past and will require adjustments on their part. And we need to keep in mind that it will not result in a 1 megawatt hour to 1 megawatt hour displacement of pollutant emissions. That is, if coal-fired power plants have to ramp up and down, we're going to get more pollution per unit of output from the coal plant than we would have if they had run solid. Doesn't mean we get more pollution overall, but we don't displace the pollution associated with a coal-fired power plant on a linear basis. Okay, so these more competitive markets in which we have more arm's length transactions between parties, this security constrained economic dispatch rule determining which plants are actually dispatched to the grid and which ones are actually selling power, means that there's a lot more risk in the market for sellers of power. They are now, instead of under the old system, building a power plant that was going to be used to serve your own customers and for which you knew you were going to earn a fair rate of return, as long as it wasn't a stupid investment. That's a very low-risk environment. The new environment is one in which you have to, as an investor, sort of think ahead and project and guess how much money am I going to be able to make selling power from this plant. And when we're talking about a 40-year investment, say, life of a plant, that's a very difficult calculation to make, particularly in a market that's so uncertain. We talked today about all these new rules, which ones will remain in effect, which ones will become more stringent, how much further down will the price of or the cost of solar drop, what will be the price of other competitive fuels, will there be, what will the market be, how much demand will there be? It's not for the weak of heart to invest in a long-lived power plant these days. And when we think about what security-constrained economic dispatch means, it means that the price of power in those markets is priced at marginal cost, the marginal cost of generating it. And if more and more of that power is coming from renewables where the marginal cost is zero, you might, as an investor, think forward and say, over time, if we price on marginal cost, which is logical from an economic theory point of view, and if the marginal cost is over time lower than my long-run average costs, I can't make any money investing in a power plant. That's true for wind power developers as well, right? It's for everybody. If there's so much zero marginal cost energy on the grid, and that's how it's priced, then that provides a disincentive to invest in power plants, period. Which then jeopardizes reliability, which over the long haul makes us worry about reliability. And so some of those RTOs and ISOs that are these organized markets that were the non-green part of that upper right-hand corner map are not all of them, but some of them are experimenting with so-called capacity markets. These are markets in which they pay owners to build plants even if they're never used, just to be available to make sure that we have adequate reserves if and when demand goes up and we need those reserves. So there's a tension. What I'm trying to say here is there's a tension between reliability and externalities and this least cost principle. We have sort of three masters we're trying to serve: minimizing costs, minimizing externalities, and maintaining a reliable grid, and they're in tension with one another. There's just a picture of sort of a way of pictorially depicting the fact that in states like mine, at both the wholesale level and the retail level, these are arm's length transactions. Retailers in my state have to buy power off the wholesale market, and they compete for customers in the retail market, and no customer will sign a contract that's longer than 12 months, no retail customer. If I can constantly shop for better prices, I'm not going to commit to any price for more than a year. And so all these retailers have locked up customers for 1 year at maximum. What does that mean? So when they make deals with wholesalers, they try to provide, if a wholesaler wants a long-term contract to finance the construction of his plant, he's not going to get it, or if he gets it, he's not going to be able to rely on it because the person to whom he's selling doesn't really know how many customers he's going to have more than 1 year from now. And so what we have are these sort of spot markets, very short-term spot markets dominating everything in places like New York and Pennsylvania and Texas and Illinois and places like that. Okay, so when we think back on sort of so given this state of electricity markets, we think about how we can green those markets. we have to just sort of keep all of this in mind as a way of sort of either tempering our expectations or making us think more sophisticatedly about how to design these various policies that will encourage green generation. And so, some of what we're doing already is having the effect of just changing pricing in these markets. How much you're willing to accept to sell power will be affected by environmental policies. I talked about the production tax credit, providing wind developers with an incentive to even pay to sell their power because they still make money that way. On the other end of the spectrum, all of these rules that are coming into effect affecting coal-fired power plants are increasing their compliance costs, influencing the amount they're willing to sell power for. But we could do other things. We could introduce environmental considerations or social cost considerations into these dispatch decisions. That's really complicated, and electric grid operators cringe at that idea because it's so complicated. But theoretically, we don't have to dispatch power on a pure least marginal cost basis, or we could say a least social marginal cost or marginal social cost basis. We could try to incorporate externalities into that decision. And in the capacity markets, we could do the same. When say the so-called PJM market in the middle Atlantic states and Midwest is paying for new capacity to be available in the future, they could add a social cost element to that market if they wanted to try and include social costs in the decision about which plants to incentivize construction of. And this is not a pie-in-the-sky idea. There are lots of engineers and economists who have come up with algorithms for doing just this. Unfortunately, they're all in academic papers. None of it's being tried in the real world. It's talked about here and there, but it's not really being done anywhere. And then, of course, the last thing is that the carbon tax could simplify a lot of this if we could get the tax level right. And I see that I'm out of time, so I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and I understand that some of the high school students in the room have had a hard time getting called on. So I'm going to take a cue from Justice Sotomayor, and if they have questions, I'm going to call on them first. So any questions? Yes. So the question is whether we need higher cost energy to respond to environmental problems like climate change.
There we go. So those policies, the sort of social cost dispatch and social cost of capacity ideas that I was talking about at the very end of my talk would do that. They would make the power from high emitters more expensive, but they don't really solve the problem of, they don't really solve that works at the expense of the reliability problem, because it doesn't really change marginal costs, because if renewables continue to dominate the spot markets, the marginal costs will be lower and lower and lower every day. I got an alert on my phone today that the marginal costs in North Texas or the cost of electricity in North Texas was down to $12 per megawatt at the afternoon peak, which is really, really low. So you have this tension, but I think economists would say yes, if we want to we want to get the prices right of fossil power, that means adding costs to them to make it more expensive to reduce demand for that power.
Can I add to that? The number one thing that I would change is that at the moment, fossil fuels get $480 billion worth of subsidies, which is vastly more than renewable energy gets. And if it were me and I was to make a change overnight, trying to change the pricing, that's exactly what I would cut out. And there's been a lot of pressure from the G20 and the OECD to scrap fossil fuel subsidies. And we're in a position where we're actually having to subsidise renewable energy so that they can compete with subsidised fossil fuels, which to me is just insanity. So that's probably what I would scrap first.
I think those are great points. The only thing I would add is that we would need to consider the equity concerns associated with an increase in price of energy. In particular, those poorer income individuals, that, let's say, that reside within the United States would probably feel those prices more. It would take up a disproportionate share of their incomes than those of higher income status.
Okay, let's go here and then over here.
Right. Yeah.
So the question is about the impact of rooftop solar panels on the shape of electricity demand and cost.
Yes, it does. It raises two other issues. One is what you should be paid for the excess power that you give back to the grid, which is a big point of contention in American states right now. I don't know about the rest of the world, but it's a huge issue. And the other is that since you are probably selling power to the grid, you're selling it onto a distribution grid that was built to go in one direction and now moves power in two directions. And so if rooftop solar penetration gets a lot bigger than it is now, then there will be sort of distribution grid upgrade issues and pricing. The pricing question is really about, since you're not taking any power off the grid or very much power off the grid anymore, and there are still fixed costs of operating the distribution grid, who's going to pay for those? It's usually been and historically been wrapped into your electricity bill, and we have to deal with the question of how to price that now.
I would just add that there might be some kind of behavioral effect going on as well, that because you have these panels on your roof, you might be more mindful of how you use energy and when you use energy.
And we have very, very high penetration in Australia, as you can imagine, with lots of solar. One of the things that's really exciting for us is energy storage is predicted to become cost competitive for the average house in Australia by 2018. And so what that means is that houses that are generating electricity on their solar cells during the day can store it in a kind of bar fridge-sized battery located often in the garage and then used at night, because what we've found is that you actually pay a lot more to purchase electricity from the grid than you get when you sell it. And our distribution companies are terrified. And so there's now a lot of talk about whether that will be done at a distribution level, where they'll have the big batteries or they will own the batteries, or whether that will be done at a household level. And there's also discussion in Australia about possibly charging PV solar customers more for their electricity when they do draw from the grid, because they aren't paying for the transmission and distribution costs which other people have to pay every day. So this is a massive issue. Happy to talk to you more about it in the break.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, sir. The question is about the effect of renewables and the growth of renewables on existing incumbent utilities, and what some observers refer to as the death spiral for utilities, disruptive innovation from renewables, and how much change can be tolerated.
So I'll comment and I'll let the other panelists comment as well, but the University of Texas has launched a big study that involves something like 20 faculty members and outside people as well, called The Full Cost of Electricity. And some of the people, I'm at the planning meetings for this, and some of the people in the room are electrical engineers, grid engineers. And they describe it as the way your question is premised correctly. There's some sort of tipping point someplace where it becomes really a big problem. And nobody knows exactly where it is, and it's probably a different number in different places. The numbers, I heard them kicking around, but I don't really think anybody should cite these because these were seat of the pants numbers where, 40%, something like that, is where you start to get operational issues. And then this question of how you price the availability of the grid, which was your point. So I think you have to start looking at capacity charges to rooftop solar operator or homeowners because they want to have the grid when they need it. And they may have to pay for that in some sort of capacity charge, irrespective of the power they take.
You might also want to look to Germany as an example. So I don't know exactly what their penetration rate is, and maybe Lincoln can help with this. Somewhere 30-40%, is that right? And here in the United States, people often say, oh, they must be terrified of this terrible situation that they're in, basically where they're hitting that threshold, whatever that threshold is. And then you go to Germany and you talk to a couple of people and they laugh and they say, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to figure out exactly what we can do going forward to make sure that our system isn't unreliable.
And in Australia, what we're seeing is that there's a push then to move on to more gas-fired generation, which does have that fast ramp-up capacity. Unfortunately, we're still embarrassingly investing in coal-fired generation. But people are now starting to push for the gas precisely for that reason, so that it can be ramped up quickly. The other thing is that most of our new wind farms actually can be switched off, and that can be done remotely, so that if they are actually producing too much power, they can actually be turned off, not just for when flocks of birds that are endangered fly towards them, which is very rare, but also where they're just generating too much power and it's uneconomic.
All right, and with that, please join with me in thanking our panel.